Thanks very much. Well, the first chap I'm going to talk about is Major Edward Manick, VC, DSO and 2 bars, MC and bar. Over the years, there's been quite a lot of debate about the exact details of Edward Manick's life. First bit is, where was he born? Some people say it was Ballincollig in West Cork, others say it was Dundalk, others say it was Aldershot, others say it was Brighton. We're not actually quite certain. Though, interestingly enough, in official documents in World War I, Manick gave his birthplace as Cork, and he always described himself as an Irishman. Though, again, as far as we know, in his adult life, he never visited Ireland at all. How many aerial victories did he achieve? It was 57, 61, 63, 73, or even more. Again, we're not exactly sure, though 61 is the generally accepted official figure now. Another question arises about his physical condition. Some biographers have said he was virtually blind in one eye. Well, he was a crack shot, and flying a fighter aeroplane while blind in one eye and being a crack shot is probably fairly difficult. My thinking is he did suffer eye damage following an amoebic infection in India when he was a child, but I don't think he was totally blind, because I don't honestly think he could have carried out, well, shooting down 61 German aircraft if you're blind in one eye. Was he a bloodthirsty Hun hater? Or was he a largely self-taught, sensitive, deep-thinking socialist and a supporter of John Raymond and Irish Home Rule? His mother was Julia Sullivan. She came from Ballincollig. She worked at the powder mill and as a domestic servant. His father, Edward Manick Sr., was from a lower middle class family in England, but he was very much the black sheep of that family, and he was an NCO in the British Army who kept getting bumped down to private again and then promoted again and bumped down again and so on. He had a bit of a checkered career. His own father, Michael, was a journalist born in Dundee, but worked extensively in Dublin as a journalist, where he married Margaret Riley, who was Irish. So undoubtedly, there was a lot of Irish connections. That's Edward, by the way. Edward Corringham, he also had a pseudonym for various reasons, chiefly to do with disguising his identity in the army, because he didn't want to be put on another charge. There was another relative, that was his father's brother, who was Jack, and he was a professional billiards player. Well, a society billiards player, that the society people would gamble on the billiards games that he played. Anyway, a fact is that Julia and Edward Sr. were married in 1883 at the Church of St Mary and St John, Ballincollig. Edward's early years, Edward Manick, they were spent in India, where his hard-drinking father was stationed, and where we think he got the amoebic infestation that affected his left eye. The family returned to England. Edward Sr. abandoned his wife and children, who were left in a state of penury. Edward Manick Jr. had to leave school. He was at the military school at Canterbury. He was 12, 13 years old and had to go into a succession of ill-paid menial jobs before he achieved modest success as a white-collar manual worker in the, what would you call it, for the GPO, for the post office, in the telephone side of it. And then, because he wanted to work outside, he became a telephone engineer stroke linesman and moved to Wellingborough. In Wellingborough, he boarded with the Isles family from 1911 onwards, where he, as I say, is the engineering department of the post office. Jim Isles, who became Manick's second and perhaps more greatly loved father, later wrote that Manick was a person with high ideals and a great love for his fellow mortals. He hated cruelty and poverty, a kinder, more thoughtful man you could never meet. He was known actually in Wellingborough as Pat, and that's another of the things. He was known as Pat or Paddy or Edward or Mick or Mickey, depending on which particular phase of his life he was in. He was a keen cricketer. He was involved in the Church Lads Brigade and then joined the Territorial Army, the Royal Army Military Corps, attaining the rank of sergeant as a territorial soldier. He was a passionate socialist and an active member of the Independent Labour Party. He was proud of his Irish ancestry and was a staunch supporter of the movement for Irish self-government. and certainly a supporter of Home Rule. He had an abiding faith that the Labour Party in Britain would secure its promise of social justice for everyone and help Ireland achieve self-government. To better himself, again, he took a job in Turkey, again in the telephones business, this time as a supervisor. So he's gradually moving up in the sort of social and economic environment. However, having moved to Turkey early in 1914, when war was declared, Turkey was on the side of Germany, Manick and many others were interned, and he was treated very harshly. And was in fact there he developed a great hatred for the Turks in particular and Germans in general. And he's on the right-hand side in the bottom row there. You can see he's quite a well-to-do looking young man now. So he came back to England. He was repatriated in April 1915. And he recovered his health. He rejoined the RAMC, rose to Sergeant Major, but then applied to join the Royal Engineers and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in April 1916. No sooner than he was commissioned in the RE, he applied for a transfer to the Royal Flying Corps, which took place in August 1916. The reason for this was he wanted to get to grips with the enemy and felt he could do that more quickly as a pilot. So he attended ground school in Reading and began learning to fly in 1916 at the Beatty School, Hendon, in one of those, that's a Mccodden tractor biplane. He was awarded his Royal Aero Club Pilot Certificate, number 3,895, on the 28th of November 1916. And in December, he proceeded to number 19 Training Squadron at Hounslow and flew. Well, that's his card there. It says Wellingborough, Beatty School, Hendon. That's his ticket that he'd qualified as a pilot. And that is what you'd have worn in those days. You can see the heavy gauntlets, leather coat, and so on. That is his flying license. And you can see there, birthplace, Cork, 24th May 1887. So he said on that official document he was born in Cork. But as I say, it's a matter of debate. He was a natural pilot with an excellent feel for his machine. He went to Hythe Gunnery School, then to number 10 Reserve Squadron in Joyce Green, flying the DH2 and FE8. That's a nice picture of him there with his wings. That's a Farman Shorthorn, another training aircraft. That's a BE2 training aircraft. Flew all of those. That's a DH2, single-seat pusher fighter, which was the most modern aircraft he flew while under training. And an FE8, again, flew that under training. That's Jimmy Mccodden. Jimmy Mccodden met Manick when he was at Joyce Green. And they struck up a friendship. Mccodden was an ace. And his father came from County Carlow. And Mccodden later wrote, Manick was a typical example of the impetuous young Irishman. I always thought he was the type to do or die. Manick was then posted on 6th of April 1917 to Sea Flight 40 Squadron, flying the Newport 17, which was a fighter aircraft. He made a very bad first impression when he got to the squadron. Mostly public school types were there, and he was, well, a rough diamond really at that time. He didn't really appreciate the atmosphere and tended to throw in his two pennyworth rather than sit and listen. He seemed too cocky for his experience, which was nil. And he offered ideas about everything, how the war was going, how it should be fought, and the role of Scout pilots. So he didn't make himself popular. He spent long hours at target practice, but appeared hesitant when confronting the enemy. He really didn't start off well at all, and he had a lot of detractors in the squadron. They got the first taste of what he proved later to be his supreme courage was when, on 19th of April 17, half of the lower wing fell off his Newport while in flight, but he actually managed to make a landing, which was pretty tricky. And he started to become accepted, and here he was first known as Mick. Further impressed on 7th of May 17 when he shot down an observation balloon, which isn't as easy as it sounds because there were very well defended observation balloons and death traps really, and also the things exploded whenever you fired a bullet into them, a bucking bullet, incendiary bullet. So they're quite dangerous things to shoot down. And he got a lot of bullet holes in his machine when he discovered when he came back. 7th of June, he scored his first aerial victory. over an aeroplane. His score began to mount up, though his sensitive nature is revealed in his diary, in which he said he went to see one of the aircraft he had shot down, and as well as the pilot, he'd killed a little black and white terrier, which is obviously the pilot's mascot. And he was dead in the seat of the aircraft, and he said, I felt exactly like a murderer. He said, I've been frightened in the diary against my will, nervous reaction. I've now conquered this physical defect, and having conquered myself, I will now conquer the Hun. Air fighting is a science. So instead of going out at hell for leather, he was trying to learn as much as he could about air fighting. And this is actually wherein his greatness lay, as a tactician and as a fighter leader, which he began to develop with 40 Squadron as a flight commander. Well, as a flying formation commander, and then as an actual bona fide flight commander. By the end of 17, he had 15 confirmed victories. But again, you could see his nerves were going a wee bit, because on seeing a fellow pilot shot down in flames, he said, that's the way they're going to get me. In the end, flames and finish. And he started to carry his service revolver, saying, if my aircraft catches alight, I'll put a bullet through my brain before I get burnt to bits. As I say, he was awarded the MC for his very fine offensive spirit and great fearlessness. As I said, it helped he was an excellent shot, which for a one-eyed man, as I say, I think is too difficult. It was remarked by the squadron that he spoke Irish English with an Indian lilt. He was made the leader of A flight, and they got a new aircraft, the SE-5, which was more powerful, faster and tougher than the Newport. So he had 15 confirmed victories and received a bar to his MC. He looked after the men in his flight with fatherly compassion and patience, helping them to develop as combat pilots. Quite often he would set it up for them. He would shoot the observer, so the machine gun at the rear wouldn't be manned, and he'd call in one of the other young pilots to finish them off, instead of taking the easy score for himself. That was quite common of Manick. He was posted back to England in 1918 for arrest from combat. His OC said, his leadership and general ability will never be forgotten by those who had the good fortune to serve under him. He had proved himself as a pilot, a teacher and a man. He was posted to London Colony as Flight Commander 74 Squadron. This unit was suffering from very low morale due to unmotivated instructors, and Manick electrified the disheartened pilots. Natural teacher, powerful speaker, and his lectures on tactics in the air were very well attended and listened to. Gentlemen, he told his men, always above, seldom on the same level, and never underneath. Never follow a victim too close to the ground, because you might be hit by fire from the trenches. He placed gunnery before flying. He said, good flying never killed a Hun yet. Always load and sight your own guns. The armourer doesn't have to do the fighting. His CO was called Major Keith Grid Caldwell, who was a New Zealander, a born CO. And he said, Mick was a very human, sensitive sort of chap. He did not hate people or things at all. I believe that his hatred of the Hun was calculated or assumed to boost his own morale and that of the squadron in general. He returned to France with 74 Squadron in April 18 and increased his victory list in the next 3 months to 33, not counting, as I said, the ones that he gave away to other pilots. It was wonderful to be in his flight, said one young pilot. To him, his flight was everything, and he lived for it. Every member had his special thought and care. And as I said, he often shot the gunner first and let the young pilot in to make the kill. It's just a squadron group, and Mick, or Edward, or Pat, is on the left-hand side there with the pipe, and Grid Caldwell is standing up at the back. One of his comrades, Taffy Jones, who oddly enough was from Wales, said he had an intriguingly complex nature, for he could be ruthless as a fighter, boyish in the mess, harsh with his pilot's mistakes, gentle and complimentary for good work, morbid when depressed. He also found solace in playing his violin and had an excellent singing voice. He liked Irish airs and Irish songs. In May, he was awarded the DSO. In the middle of June, Jones noticed that Manick's nerves were noticeably fraying. He was now continually talking about being shot down in flames. He wrote to his sister, Manick did, "I'm supposed to be going on leave if I live long enough." He was fighting depression and was plagued by dreams of burning aircraft. So he had PTSD, as it would be described today. And I could go on in a lot more detail about that, but obviously time wouldn't allow. 18th of June, he went home on leave in England. He was informed he had been promoted to Major and given command of 85 Squadron, previously led by the Canadian ace, Major William A. Billy Bishop, who was the ultimate lone wolf, who was out to put up his own score under fairly dubious and controversial circumstances. So Manick then got a second bar to his DSO, first bar to his DSO. He saw his mother, who was now an alcoholic. He went to stay with Jim Iles in Wellingborough, who saw that he had changed dramatically. Gone was the old sparkle we knew so well. Gone was the incessant wit. I could see him wring his hands together to conceal his shaking and twitching. Back in France again with 85 Squadron in July 18, his arrival was a godsend to the squadron. He set to work teaching his young men about aerial tactics, and the score, mixed score, and the score of the squadron went up. His personality completely transformed a unit, which itself was low in morale. That's a very good book. I got it from Amazon, and it's his personal diary for several months of his life in 1917. It's certainly worth getting out of the library. In fact, I was sitting reading it again this morning in the hotel. But it's, some of the material written by the compiler Frederick Outen isn't in line with modern thinking, modern historical research. So take the Outen bits with a certain amount of a pinch of salt. But the diary itself, the entries are worth reading because you get an idea of mixed personality. There's 85 Squadron. Manick's not in that picture. But on the 10th of July, he heard that Jimmy Mccodden had been killed in a flying accident. News that hurled him back into depression, but spurred him into a furious killing spree of his own. But he was also taking risks and now ignoring his own advice, following down a victim and spraying the wreckage with bullets. He really was on the edge. 26th of July, Lieutenant Donald Inglis walked into the mess where Manick was smoking his pipe and playing the Londonderry Air on the gramophone. "Have you got a Hun yet, Inglis?" Manick said. And the negative answer replied, "Well, come on out and we'll get one." So in the usual way, Manick located a two-seater, attacked first. Inglis came in behind and finished off the enemy to get his first kill. Manick dived again and then went down to circle the burning wreck. Inglis saw the rudder being kicked and the aircraft moved from side to side violently. Flame came out of the side of the machine, got bigger and bigger. The nose dropped, he went into a slow right-hand turn about twice and hit the ground in a burst of flame, shot down by ground fire. "The bastards killed my major. They killed Mick. He has no known resting place." His friends campaigned for him to be awarded the VC. You can see by the way, look in his face there, that's one of the last pictures taken of him. Can you see the stress? Different looking man. And he's what there, 28 years old. Looks older than me. So, what did they say about him after? That's a combat report, by the way, which again, I haven't really got the time to look at in any detail. That's just his investiture. "I was awed by his personality," wrote McClanahan, McScotch, who served with him. "He's idolised by all who came into contact with him. He was a man among men. A warm, lovable individual of many moods and characteristics. I shall always salute his memory." Captain W.E. Johns, the author of the Biggles books, wrote, "Irish by birth, he displayed all the impetuosity of the Irish. He was a fearless fighter, a brilliant leader, an exponent of air combat tactics of his time." There he is with his SE-5A. Biggles, there's W.E. Johns on the left-hand side. And the RAF's VC-10, one of those was named Edward Manick VC, and that was between November 68 and until the VC-10s retired in 2013. I would say he was indisputably one of the top aces of the Royal Flying Corps RAF, one of the best fighter pilots and air fighters of his time, an innovative tactician and motivator, and is well worthy of further remembrance and honour. The end. Next one, please. I'm just going to have to gallop along here. Hopefully I'll get time to get through everybody. So this is Smith Barry, Robert Smith Barry. Many young Irish men, or those of Anglo-Irish parentage, joined the flying services during World War I. A friend of mine, Dublin-based historian Joe Gleeson, has calculated as many as 6,000 Irishmen or Anglo-Irish volunteered for the RFC, RNAS or RAF. So here we have probably my favourite, the great Smith Barry. He was the man who taught the air forces of the world to fly. And that's a quote from Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Trenchard. So, Raymond Smith Barry was born 1886 in London, but he was the only son of James Hugh Smith Barry of Fota Island, Queenstown, who is directly descended from the 4th Earl of Barrymore. His mother, Charlotte, was the daughter of the 3rd Earl of Enniskillen. So indisputably Smith Barry, though being born in London, was Irish. He went to Eton College, where he had a report saying, an awful little boy with no aptitude whatsoever. He then went to Trinity, Cambridge, which he left without a degree. And apparently he didn't really impress any of his tutors there. He joined the consular service and was posted to Constantinople, but didn't enjoy that either. He then had an ambition to be a concert pianist, at one stage practicing for 8 hours a day for 2 years. And he also loved fast motor cars, as did many young men who had a bit of money of that era. He actually then went to Larkhill, the Bristol School of Flying, in 1911, and gained his Royal Aero Club ticket, number 161, on the 28th of November 1911, flying in one of those, a Bristol box kite. Activity at Larkhill was very well documented in the pages of Flight magazine. Smith B, as he was known, was mentioned many times as a student, and he was so good he was actually an instructor there not long after getting his ticket. The instruction, by the way, was that you sat behind the pilot to begin with, following through on the controls, what they were doing, leaning over his shoulders to manipulate them. And your first solo would be your first time sitting at the controls yourself, and the first time you actually had the opportunity to use the rudder pedals. It was that rudimentary. So you had to be good to fly, but you didn't go up very high. The chief instructor was Henri Julio. There's a box kite flying over, and there's some of the chaps at the school having a photo taken, and that's how you learn to fly, to begin with the instructor, you sitting behind the instructor. And notice that they're very well dressed for the occasion. I think that was a posed photograph, I have the feeling. Smith B was once fined 15 quid for damaging his aeroplane in a heavy landing. That, by the way, is how they got to the airfield in the morning in that charabanc from the inn where they were staying. Oh, a lot of fun, I think. A very promising pupil, and solo of 15 minutes after circling round, and he landed with a vol plane from 200 feet. That's when you switch the aircraft off and glide down and make a nice landing. It's the sign of a good pilot in those days. He was mentioned as giving, that by the way at the bottom is Henri Julio and his signature, dated 1910. There's a nice picture of a box kite. Those magnificent men in their flying machines, really. So now we come to, really this is the more serious side of the business. He went to the Central Flying School at Upavon, 17th of August 1912. He was a member now of the Royal Aero Club, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant probationary in the Royal Flying Corps. And this was course number 1 at CFS, where he would now earn, he was a pilot, he had his Royal Aero Club ticket. He now was going to earn his wings in the Royal Flying Corps. One of the other people on the course, by the way, was Major Trenchard, who was quite an elderly pilot. He was about nearly 40. So the primary aim was not to produce aviators, they're all supposed to know how to fly, but professional war pilots. There's only one snag about this. Nobody had any idea in 1912 of what a professional war pilot was, because there'd never been one. they didn't know what they really had to learn and couldn't predict it. But they thought, oh, well, they'll probably replace horses in the reconnaissance role. So there was no air-to-air combat wasn't the agenda because A, it hadn't been thought of, and B, there weren't any weapons to do it anyway at that stage. And aircraft capable of that weren't introduced for at least another 3 years. The school's aim was to be achieved by accepting for advanced training people who already held their ticket. They flew Morris Farman's, and there's, by the way, a close-up. That was Smith B, and that's a close-up of the picture, and then just another shot of him. So they flew Farman's and BE-4s, pretty rudimentary types. The Farman was fitted with dual controls for stick and rudder, but not for the engine throttle or switch. So again, when you're on your own, it was the first time you had the chance to use the throttle or switch the engine on and off. Number 1 course completed December 1912. Graduates could carry out short 40 to 50 mile triangular flights cross-country by map and landmark, local flights 20 to 30 minutes at heights of up to 4,000 feet and a speed of 40 to 50 miles an hour. So that gives you some idea of the level that we're at. Smith B, early in this career, pulled into a steep climb immediately after taking off. You mustn't do that kind of thing, his instructor said. He is reported to have responded with a quizzical look. He retorted, after being pulled up about his disregard of the rule book, "You know, Captain, I feel much safer flying that machine dangerously." He was so good, he became an instructor at CFS and flew about 7 different aircraft, again documented in Flight magazine. He was a very good pilot, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And that's just some of the types that he flew at CFS, and there's another picture of CFS. In 1913, he took part in a Royal Aero Club balloon race with Captain the Honourable Claude Brabazon. He kept his hand in flying at the Blériot School at Brooklands and was confirmed as a second lieutenant RFC Special Reserve in April 13. And the same year he married Kitty Colburn. With the outbreak of war, he went to number 5 Squadron in France as a direct entry Special Reserve. Now that meant he had no military experience whatsoever. He was a gentleman, but he wasn't really an officer and gentleman because he'd never been to officer school. And this helps explain his reputation as a maverick. No respect for senior officers, absolutely no respect whatsoever for senior officers who he thought were fools. And the list of people whom he thought were fools was not a short one. But before actual combat broke out, he was flying one of those, a BE-8 bloater, on the 18th of August, which is described as a nasty contraption, one of the least successful products of the Royal Aircraft Factory. Suffered control failure, it crashed. The observer was killed. He was then in hospital in France with 2 broken legs, which caused him to be lame permanently thereafter. So he's in hospital in France. The Germans were advancing. He asked the hospital staff to get me a cab, which was a horse-drawn cab, brought down the steps of the hospital on a stretcher, loaded into the cab and to the station cabby. And he got home in the guard's van of a train, and then across the channel, of course. His CO at the time said, "Don't worry about that smash. I'm sure it was not your fault." No, it was the bloater's fault because it was a horrible aeroplane. 1915, just mentioning training, one of his contemporaries said, training was a pretty perfunctory business in 1915. Dual control consisted of a few circuits and landings in which the instructor flew the aeroplane, the pupil having his hands and feet in the controls to get the feel of them. Occasionally, a bang in the back caused him to look round and see his instructor waving his hands in the air to show that he had relinquished control. A variation on that was that a length of string or cord was attached to the pupil's left arm. 1 tug meant take control, 2 tugs meant let go. You know, it was as high-tech as that. And there was the beginnings of a glimmer of thought on, we've got to do this a bit better, because the RFC was getting bigger and bigger. The role of aeroplanes was getting more and more crucial, and the losses from pupils in flying schools was getting to be enormous and unsustainable. Smith Barry, by this time, had persuaded his doctors that he was fit enough to fly and became a flying instructor at Northolt. He flew anti-Zeppelin patrols as well. And it's interesting and very typical of him, he made a very generous donation to the new RFC hospital in London. Returned to France April 1916, commander of A Flight 60 Squadron. equipped with the Moran bullet. Tricky to fly, giving an impression it was trying to do its best to kill the pilot all the time you flew it. But a very nippy fighter. That, by the way, Ferdy Waldron was born at the Curragh. He was, again, Anglo-Irish, and he was the OC of 60 Squadron, who also was one of the first military pilots to fly to Ireland with 2 Squadron in 1913. Generally speaking, the bullet was not a success. That's Ferdy Waldron again with Smith Barry, and there's the bullet, which you can see is a monoplane. Fixed Lewis gun, and the propeller, by the way, had steel blades, so it hadn't an interrupter gear. You fired the machine gun, and if it passed through the propeller disc, well and good. If it didn't, it hit one of the steel blades and was deflected or crushed, or hopefully didn't fly back and hit you. Offensive patrols. He was then was put in command of the squadron because Ferdy was shot down and killed. What did they say of him? Smith Barry was a great character, an Irishman with all an Irishman's charm, a trifle eccentric. He was a fine pilot, though beloved by the squadron. His superiors sometimes found him a little trying officially. It was often said, half admiringly, of a man by his friends that he doesn't care a damn for anyone. He could do anything with an airplane and delighted in frightening his friends with his antics. A fine if original squadron commander, almost too original for the RFC, where being original was actually encouraged. He had a great contempt for precedents. He doesn't suffer fools gladly and is smarter than most of his superiors. Because of his wealth and family background, he's very independent and doesn't give a damn for anyone else's opinion. His passion for flying is almost mythic. He's a splendid, courageous pilot. One of his pilots was Captain Ball, Albert Ball VC, whom he encouraged to be a bit of a maverick himself. The meat of the story then, which I'll have to do pretty briefly, is that he was absolutely shocked by the incompetence of new pilots coming to France. Not it was their fault. It was just they weren't getting the training they needed. Half of pilots were being killed in training. They've only 7 hours in the air, sir, he said to Trenchard, and it's bloody murder. They've barely learned to fly, never mind fight. So Trenchard said to him, OK, don't worry me any more with your complaints. If you think you can do any better, go home and do it. It's time you tried out all those ideas of yours you've been pestering me with. I've told the training people, so don't let me or you down. Now, the flying training syllabus had been amended and updated to a certain extent over the last couple of years. But he was given command of number 1 Reserve Squadron in December 16. So, Gosport had this to begin with, the Longhorn, which you can see looks like one of the ones he flew in 1913. Utterly useless to prepare people for going to France. He wanted instructors to view their task as a vocation, not as an escape from operational flying, because those who came back from operational flying usually had shattered nerves and were overworked, overstressed and inexperienced. And because of the strain they were under, they did very little to motivate their pilots. Advice such as, shove our nose down, you bloody fool, do you want to kill us both? That was not uncommon. Which wasn't exactly motivating for a pilot. So first of all, he wanted to get rid of these pretty useless, stable training aircraft and focus on a much more standard machine. And this is it, the Avro 504, one of the best training aircraft in history. Was easily flown, but difficult to fly accurately. So what he did was, he said, the pupil sits in the front cockpit the whole time. He's equipped with a full set of controls. The instructors sit behind. They communicate with the trainee. They demonstrate, and then they say, you do it. Demonstrate again, you do it. And they had a patter, a set of prepared instructions. So the instructor was saying the same thing at the same time to every pupil until they got it right. That's just an Avro at Gosport. That's the office. Well, that's his house that was informally used as the mess. There's Smith B and Kitty and a couple of his instructors. That's the Gosport tube. There's a helmet that the pilot, the trainee, wore. It had earphones, and you had a tube that the instructor could speak through. So now the instructor could be heard. He wasn't bawling over the noise of the engine. And that made a huge difference. There's the tube in action. You can see in the front cockpit there the student is wearing the Gosport tube, as it became known. And all these measures revolutionized training. The other thing he did was to encourage pilots to go in for maneuvers. Previously, it'd be, oh, don't spin an aircraft, it's too dangerous. He said they've got to learn how to get out of spins. They've got to learn to get out of trouble. There's no point going to France just knowing how to fly straight and level. So he encouraged the instructors to train the pilots in tricky maneuvers, how to get out of danger. He said, there's nothing inherently dangerous as long as you know how to get out of it. This is how to get out of a spin. And once they were flying solo, he said, within reason, try as many tricky things as you can, because it's far too late if there's a Hun on your tail to discover if you can actually do stunt flying. So, an aeroplane is a machine that responds to a simple, honest set of rules, control, and instructions. He drove away fear and the real danger that existed for those who were flying aeroplanes in the blackest ignorance of even its first principles. The standard of pilots immediately went up. The Smith-Barry system was spread throughout the Royal Flying Corps and then, of course, the Royal Air Force. Unadventurous flying is a danger in itself, leaving the pupil totally unprepared for emergencies. Nothing within reason you can do in the air is dangerous, as long as you know why you do it and how to get out of the resultant mess if it goes wrong. So then, from training trainees, he trained instructors, and that was the next logical development at the School of Special Flying, and wrote the manual on training. That's what Alverstoke House looks today. If you want to go and visit at Gosport, as you can see, it's a pub. And that's the blue plaque in his name. That's a piece out of the instructor's course manual. That's a certificate saying that that lieutenant has qualified. That's, again, at Gosport. And you can just see the massed ranks of all the same type now, the 504s. Another type they used was the Bristol Scout. They had them painted up, some of them in those fancy colours. That's Sopwith Camel, which again they used at Gosport. And that's Smith B about to test a captured German Albatross. And this, moving on, that is the aircraft he flew post-war, post-Moth. But just before we come on to that, he was promoted to Brigadier General in 1918, a flying training group. But once again, he came into conflict with authority. And a famous telegram said, I'm returning to Gosport. Smith-Barry, Brigadier General, stop. Have arrived at Gosport. Smith-Barry, Lieutenant Colonel, stop. So his training revolution was embraced by the RAF and by many air forces around the world. And the Smith-Barry system is still of relevance today in the training the RAF actually gives to its pilots. Between the wars, he was a country gentleman, piloted that aircraft, and grew a long grey beard, for some reason best known to himself. He shaved it off in 1939, rejoining the service as a pilot officer, was a ferry pilot, and then was an instructor in India, a ground instructor. Sadly, Kitty died in 1941, but he married Anne Garnier in 1945. He had a crash in 1940, went to South Africa, and died in 1949 at a reasonably young age still, after an operation on his leg. Operation went well, but he just didn't recover. To conclude, a close friend and distant relative wrote in the Times, as a man he was modest and unassuming, a charming companion and the best company in the world. It was not that he overshadowed others, he seemed to bring out the best of them. And somebody else said, the English half was Smith, solid and practical. Barry was brilliant and wild, Irish. Together, a wholly fascinating and lovable fellow. Not only did he do great work, he was also a great man. So that's Smith B, and there he is in 1942 at the age of 56. So he was 63 when he died. That's the book you can read about him, Pioneer Pilot by Treadray. It's a very good book. And that's the end. Next one, please.
Very well.
10 minutes on Carberry. But I did start 10 minutes late, so hopefully you'll have time for Lord Carberry. One of the most remarkable figures to grace Irish skies. John C. Evans Freak, Lord Carberry, 1892 to 1970. He gained his aviator's certificate at the Moran-Saulnier School of Flying at Villacoublay on the 2nd of September 1913. There's the school. And that's the sort of type of aircraft he'd have learned on. That's a Dieperdussen. He'd never flown one before, but in the second Schneider Trophy Speed Contest in April 14, he borrowed one of those and entered it in the contest and did quite well. So he's a pretty decent pilot. Going back slightly, as I said, he was born in 1892, succeeded to the title at Castle Freak in 1898, and grew up in very comfortable circumstances. He gained a reputation for wild behaviour from boyhood. Apparently, at the age of 8, he placed an apple on the head of a gardener and shot it off with an air pistol. He also shot the hat off the head of a poacher in the castle grounds, slightly grazing his head. And apparently the hat, complete with bullet hole, has been preserved somewhere. So you have to look for it. Yeah, I mean, presumably the Carberry family might know. I'd certainly like to see it. At the age of 14, he went secretly to Cork and arrived back driving his first motor car, which, for 1914 was even then going at a bit. June 14, he took part in the London to Manchester air race flying a Bristol Scout. There's Castle Freak, and there's the Bristol Scout. Now that looks like a proper airplane, doesn't it? For 1914, that was really top of the range. Powerful, manoeuvrable, fast. Flying at over 100 miles an hour, which was fast for 1914. So pre-war, he was certainly a magnificent man, flying in various of the competitions that were arranged really for the young and quite wealthy. He flew the Bristol in the London-Paris-London race in the same year, but had to make a forced landing in the English Channel with engine failure and was picked up by a passing steamer without getting his feet wet. That's the Bristol again. That's not one of his better landings. And there's his lordship. You can see he looks a bit like a noble lord, doesn't he? There's a certain aristocratic demeanour there, isn't there? You could just see him giving instructions to his butler. There's a nice one. There's a Moran closest to you and a Blériot just behind. So it gives you an idea of the type of aircraft. You can see even then the Blériot looks a little bit more flimsy than the Moran, because you can see it hasn't got the streamlining of being fully covered. I mean, underneath the Moran was like that, but was covered. So he came home to Ireland in 1914, made several flights in and around Cork in his 80 horsepower Moran Saulnier. And if any of you don't know what 80 horsepower means, it was 59 kilowatts, whatever that means. So compared to the previous aircraft, Blériots, Dieperdussens, Handley Page, Farmans, used by other showmen, the Moran was really modern. And by the way, if you want to read about Ireland aviation 1909 to 1914, I can recommend a book to you. It's called Showmen, Pioneers and the Royal Flying Corps. It's published by Colourpoint Books, and I wrote it. And it's available from all good libraries. I get around about 5p every time you take it out of a library, anywhere in Ireland or GB. So if you take it out several hundred times, that'll be great. Now, where did he perform? At the Clonakilty Agricultural Show on the 5th of July 1914, he performed the first loop-the-loop in Ireland. This was pretty significant. The other aircraft that displayed here, flying around in a gentle circle, taking off and landing, that was plenty. Somebody actually looping the loop was wow. How did he do that? I can't impress upon you too strongly that Carberry was the first man to bring aerobatics to Ireland and showed people in Ireland what aircraft could do. And I would say definitely inspired young Irishmen, and certainly in this area, to join the flying services. I think that would be probably his main contribution. There's a lot more I could say about him, but I'm going to have to whiz through. He was taking up passengers. Basic charge for a flight was a £5. With a loop, it was 25 quid. Now, in 1914 money, that wasn't cheap. 9th of July, one of his passengers was Miss L.E. Townsend of now Lislen, hard to say, Lislen, that's hard, Lislenane. Right. Okay, well, if you can come across any of the Townsend family, I'd be most interested. Because again, part of the reason for me coming down here is if there's any local information I can be given or put in contact with, I'd be most interested. He then married, that's a nice one of the Moran landing, I like that picture. And there's University Football Grounds, 9th July 14. That's in Cork at the Mardyke. And that's Josie Metcalfe, his wife. A spectacularly beautiful young woman, the daughter of Major Jumbo Metcalfe, who came from an acceptable military background. And she was actually born in Australia. And she actually flew with Carberry in Ireland more than once. Again, a lot more I could say about the flying, because I've quoted in what I've written about him quite a bit from local newspapers describing the flights in some detail. And, if you go Ireland Online newspapers and put in Carberry, 1914, you'll get stacks of stuff. It's well worth reading if you don't want to buy the book. He gave other displays over Bandon, Beaumont Park, Blackrock, where one of his passengers were Master Gerald Cobb, who was only 11 years old. There's a nice picture of him. There were shrieks and gasps of terror when the noble lord looped the loop over the crowd. José went up with her husband. She was wearing a tight-fitting dark cap, and although said by some to be looking rather pale, she evidently enjoyed the prospect of looping the loop. I wonder how her lunch was after that. I have looped the loop in a biplane, and it's fun. It really is. You're hanging in your straps, thinking, I hope to God these straps hold. It was a tiger moth. It was good fun. I was a lot younger then, I can tell you. But so he went on in Ireland in this few months before war broke out. Waterford, the agricultural show, big chunk there out of the Irish Times describing it. Bray, at the cricket ground there, series of spirals to a height of 3,000 feet. Executed several loops and tail slides over Bray Head. Took up several passengers. And, a good time was had by all. Powers Court, Castle Bernard, which is the seat of the Earl of Bandon, the abandoned Earl he was known as, and the next Earl of Bandon, not that one, became a Air Chief Marshal, Paddy Bandon. So again, Paddy Bandon may well have been inspired by seeing Carberry. In fact, I'm certain he was. So you can certainly look up the abandoned Earl. That's Paddy Bandon. After a circuit of the town, Lord Carberry looped the loop twice, did the dead leaf drop, and other exhibition flying. On descending, he was given a most enthusiastic reception and was presented with an address by the local branch of the Irish National Volunteers. He was a committed Irish nationalist, despite being a member of the ascendancy and the aristocracy and so on. August further displays were given. That's just nice pictures of him and his mechanic. I like that one, actually. It looks rather as if he's enjoying himself there, doesn't it? Notice his flying hat turned round backwards. Now, where were we? Yeah. August further displays Clonmel, Tralee, Youghal, but with the declaration of the war, flight noted remaining fixtures arranged had been cancelled. But despite his strongly held nationalist views, Carberry offered his services to the government and was commissioned into the Royal Naval Air Service. That's interesting there, because you can see the sun shining through the wings of his Moran. It's a nice picture, I think. Just shows you how flimsy they really were. That's one of the types he flew, the Sopwith Tractor seaplane. Delivered to Culshot, August 1914. Flown by Sidney Pickles with Flight Sub-Lieutenant Lord Carberry as passenger. Unfortunately, it was wrecked on the 3rd of September. It wasn't Carberry's fault, because he was only a passenger at that stage. He was also involved in 2 further prangs. In that one, which crashed at Dunkirk, and then another crash at Antwerp. These were in September 1914. He was really quite severely hurt. Now, I know absolutely nothing about the rest of his service career. I haven't been able to find out anything, so I'd be most interested in finding out any more about it. Flew one of those as well, the Sopwith Tabloid. Now, just to finish, I think he was an inspiration to the young men of Ireland, and particularly the young men of this district, as well, of course, as Paddy Bandon. Undeniable, he had a most unusual personality. Shooting the thing off the gardener's head wasn't, maybe of normal aristocratic behaviour, I don't know. But apparently before he left Castle Freak, he took a shotgun to the family portraits. He spent some time in the USA, where apparently his application for citizenship was refused because it was alleged he'd been involved in bootlegging. He then went to Kenya, and he was part of the Happy Valley set, apparently, and had a troubled personal life, should we say, again. But despite all of this, he lived to a ripe old age, which I think is quite remarkable in the circumstances. He must have had the constitution of a bull. So there we are, 3 Irishmen with West Cork connections, all of whom I think are absolutely fascinating. And thank you very much indeed.